Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us on our Sunday morning video service. We'd love to have you all be a part of this. Too bad we can't see your smiling faces. You are smiling, right? Anyway, I hope you're outside enjoying this beautiful weather. I think spring/summer is upon us. So, like I say, get out, smell the flowers, go for a walk, whatever the case may be, and enjoy this beautiful weather. I just have a couple of things to go over before we turn the time over to Pastor Carl to talk more about the virtues. Our men's group will meet this Monday night at 6:30 on Zoom. Their normal Saturday morning breakfast or coffee or whatever they call it will not be held next Saturday or the following Monday night service because it's Memorial Day weekend. So hopefully you have a barbecue with your family and enjoy some of that time together with your family in lieu of the men's group this time. Our women's group will still meet on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. We'd love to have you be a part of that. Today is our normal tithes and offerings. You can go to thefathershouse.org. You can set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can give to our missions that way also. You can mail a check to 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you'd like Pastor Carl and I to come by and pick up your tithe check, we'd be happy to do that. Just give us a call and let us know. Mentioning the missions, we have been talking about Pastor Patricia in Argentina that had to have her shoulder surgery done, and I wanted to let you know she did get the surgery done. It was very successful. Very strange. Pastor Mario was sending me pictures that her husband were taking. He got to go into the hospital room before she was even out of the anesthetic and take pictures. And it was like, okay, that would not happen in America. But anyway, they were just short of the additional funds required for that surgery because they found another bone that was missing that needed a metal plate put in. So we're trying to raise an additional $500. So anything you can give towards her recovery and past surgery would be greatly appreciated. We only raised a few dollars last week, but I know people weren't prepared for it. So if you can give anything towards that, I know she would be greatly appreciative. They sent us a video, and even though it was in Spanish, you could tell the thankfulness in their heart, the humbleness on their hearts. You can understand Pastor Carl and Pastor Penny, and you can understand the Father's house and gracias over and over and over again. So I know they're very thankful for that. And again, we appreciate all that was raised to help for that surgery and just a short goal left to go. So again, anything you can give towards that would be greatly appreciated. Lastly, I just wanted to mention our Logos University is going to be holding or starting a discipleship class. We have two books that we're going to go through. One is Emotionally Healthy Discipleship by Peter Scazzaro. The second is The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which if you've listened to Pastor Carl preach at all, you know he's a mentor of his and a beautiful, beautiful perspective on what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. In fact, he was martyred as part of that during World War II, like 2 weeks before the war ended. So anyway, I think it's going to be a great study. For those of you who want to take it, it's the cost of the books, which is about $32 to $35. I can get those ordered for you, or I can give you the information. You can order those yourself. We're going to be starting the class on June 8th, which is a Wednesday night. It will be held on Zoom. I don't know whether we'll be starting at 6 or 6:30. I think it depends on who joins us and who wants to be part of that study, depending on your availability. You know, some people work and they have to get home and have dinner, and we totally understand that. But again, I want to encourage you to be a part of this class because I think people just say, you know, I need more, I need more, I need more. I need deeper study. Well, this is a great opportunity to take that on because not only does it give you a sense of community within the class, but it's a deeper study on what God wants us to understand what discipleship actually is and what that means in our lives. So again, we'd love to have you be part of it. Let Pastor Carl or myself know and we'll get the books ordered. I know some people have ordered their own books, which that is totally fine, and we're really looking forward to this class. So we'd love to have you be a part of it. That's really all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl to talk more about the virtues.
Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you today? I trust everything is going as planned. Everything is going great. And even when if things look like they're not going great, from God's perspective, I want to tell you they are going great. And that's because God has a plan for your life, for my life, for all of his creation. And because God is perfect in goodness, his plan for us has to be aligned with his goodness or his good intentions towards us. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. But I wanted to just say good morning. If you're watching this in the morning, if it's evening, afternoon, whatever it is, Buenos tardes if you're watching it later. But whatever the case might be, it's okay because you're watching it. So we want to welcome you to the Father's House and to this, which is our Sunday morning video recording of what we're going to be talking about on our Sunday morning. And so what we've been discussing, we've been talking about the idea and the notion of the cardinal virtues, right? Of courage, temperance, what else was there? Justice and prudence. And then the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. We've talked about faith. And now this is our second week talking about hope. So I want to talk a little bit more about hope because last week we just barely scratched the surface. As a matter of fact, after teaching on it on Sunday morning, one of the congregants came up to me and said, "Can you do more teaching on hope? Because I think you just scratched the surface and I want to know more about it." And I said, well, that's all we did last week was we scratched the surface of what hope is. Again, hope is a Christian virtue, and it's a virtue that works in conjunction with faith and with the other virtue of love. And so there's a continuity between the three. But I want to talk a little bit today about faith and hope. But I want to talk, first of all, I want to reiterate what we said a little bit last week in a nutshell, which is really found in the last part of the chapter, well, I guess actually kind of mid-chapter and to the end of Hebrews chapter 6. What we established last week was the idea of what hope is anchored in. Now, remember we talked last week about the idea that hope is the Christian anchor, or the anchor of the Christian soul is hope, not faith. Faith allows us to enter into a relationship with God, to begin to walk with God, and to follow his decrees. But hope is more of that enduring factor in the midst of and going through the perils of life and all the things that we face. It's almost like the idea of being on a sea when it gets rough and we think we're going to perish. Hope becomes our anchor. But our anchor being this anchor, and if you think about it, an anchor is only as strong as what it is attached to. So if you drop an anchor and your anchor, let's say your boat is drifting towards being shipwrecked on the rocks, if your anchor is just being drug in the sand because there's nothing to anchor it to, eventually you're going to hit those rocks because your anchor didn't sink into anything and you're going to suffer shipwreck. So how is it that hope applies to us as Christians of not suffering shipwreck in the midst of the storms of life? Now, I have to say that the storms of life are there for each and every one of us. They will always be there. That's not something that's going to go away. Just because we become a Christian doesn't mean our life is going to be easy sailing. Part of that has to do with the natural makeup of man, the natural makeup of the planet. The idea that if a tornado runs through a city and destroys that city, a Christian can't simply say, well, God, why did you do this to me? Maybe the wicked deserved it, but I didn't deserve it, because in the natural effect, everybody was accumulated. Scripture tells us that the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. And so there's this idea where going through life, we deal with circumstances that God knows about, and sometimes we deal with circumstances that God puts us into by way of perfecting us, by putting us into the crucible of a storm, so that we personally grow. Because what God's interested most is the fact that you grow in your character development and we become more like his son, Jesus Christ, which ultimately ends we become more godlike in all the things that we do. Now, going back to the anchor. In the midst of these perilous storms, if we don't... I'm having trouble hearing you. Oh, that was my watch. Forgive me for that. I have no idea what happened. Well, I guess I better talk louder because my watch just said it didn't have it had trouble hearing me. I don't know what that means. You know, when a watch talks back to you, you really have a problem, don't you? Anyway, let's go back to the anchor of our hope. So the anchor of our hope then is our anchor is only as good as that which it is attached to. Now, in our case, what the Bible says in Hebrews chapter 6 is that our anchor is placed behind the veil, which is symbolic. We won't get into that today. Behind the veil of where the very glory of God or the presence of God is located. In other words, our anchor is anchored in the very and on the very presence and existence and reality of God. Now that's important. It's not anchored in a small rock. It's not being drug along the bottom of the ocean so we suffer shipwreck. That in the midst of perilous times, when we're facing hard times in our life, if we have our hope anchored within the veil or anchored in the presence or anchored in God, then what happens is that we've got this solid object which cannot be moved. Matter of fact, in that text it says that is unchangeable. In other words, it can't even be moved location because the minute you move something out of a location, you've changed its location, so it therefore is changeable. When we're anchored to God in an unchangeable way, it means it's immovable, impossible to move. So that means that we cannot suffer shipwreck when our anchor is focused on God or when our anchor is tied into Him. And that's our hope. Our hope is anchored in God that's unchangeable. Now, as much as it's anchored there, the reason it's anchored there, which is talked about in the book of Hebrews, is it's anchored there because God gave us a promise, if you remember, that it would be anchored there because all who trust in Him, which is a significant or a sign of hope, will not be disappointed. And so there's this notion idea of that when we put our hope in God, that God won't disappoint us because He's promised not to. The second thing is He took an oath. He took an oath, and in taking an oath, He said, you know, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, but nothing but the truth. So help me, me. So He couldn't swear by anybody greater because He's the greatest. He couldn't swear by anybody more perfect, more authority, more knowing, more powerful. So He took an oath on His own power, that if He broke that oath, at that point, He would cease to be perfect and therefore could not be God. So therefore, it's unchangeable when we focus and anchor our hope in God. So that's hope in a nutshell. Now I want to move forward and I want to give you an illustration of how hope works in an individual's life, because sometimes it's better to use an individual to kind of explain and see this process of hope that works. And the reason why Christ is our ultimately and God is ultimately our only hope. So we're going to look at a couple of things. I'm going to talk a little bit about something and an incident that happened in the life of David. And then I'm going to tie it to the psalm that he wrote about that. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is because sometimes when we read the book of Psalms in the Old Testament, what we do is we think, well, that's a nice poem. That's a nice psalm that they wrote. That's a nice song that they wrote. But the idea with the Psalms is the Psalms were always wrought or birthed out of experience. It wasn't like a songwriter came and said, well, I think I'm just going to write a song. The Psalms reflect really the history of Israel, the history of individuals, and their interaction always with God and with the circumstances around them. So we're going to talk a little bit about a psalm, but the psalm will be what we're going to close with. First, the reason that the psalm that we're going to talk about is written, and the psalm will be Psalm 62. So David, who is known as the sweet psalmist of Israel, was a king, a warrior, a shepherd boy, and a musician, as well as a family man, and amongst other things. But because of things in his life and circumstances, by his fall with Bathsheba, it set within his family, it set this discord in his family, where because of that fall and some other things that happened, what happened was there was this tension in David's house, and there was this rivalry between him and his son Solomon. Now, at this time, David was the king. Being the king, it was afforded everything that was offered to him as a king. But his son Absalom wanted the throne. And so what happened was that the day finally came as Absalom grew, that through usurping David's authority and manipulating some of his warriors and the people of the city of Jerusalem and of the nation of Israel at that time, and at that time it was a unified nation, that what he did was he decided that he was going to betray his father and that he was going to take over as being king, which meant that David was in a predicament where his very own son was out to kill his father, David, and then thereby ascend to the throne and rule the land. Now, so what happened in this story is that's exactly what Absalom did. He thought about doing that. He conspired with all the different people to do that. But the day came when, after making the choice to do that, he actually became intentional about it. And at that point, then, what he began to do was he began to act on the plan that he had. And so he left with some of the men of David's army, and he went to a place far away. He also had gotten at that time, he also had gotten some of David's closest advisors to side with him. So David's friends and his most godly advisors, those he looked to for counsel concerning God, concerning war, concerning social and political matters, many and most of them were willing and able and eventually deserted David to follow his son when his son wanted to kill him. So sometimes we think about that and we read it at face value and we read it as a story without a lot of emotion. So the day came when Absalom was outside of the city, and he proclaimed in where he was, where he'd gone to offer or pretended to offer sacrifice to God. And he proclaimed to the people of Israel that he was now the reigning king and it was not David. Now remember that at that time, Absalom had already manipulated the people, and most of the people and many of the people wanted to follow Absalom rather than David. But remember this, Absalom was not the king that was appointed by God. David was the king appointed by God. But if David was the king that was appointed by God, why was it that he was going through these things that he was going through? Why was it that God was allowing this in David's life in this perilous time? And you think about emotionally where David would have been. Let's say you were the king. And let's say, and many of us have experienced this, how many of you have experienced the betrayal of family members? How about those in the religious community in which you grew up? Your very Christian counselors, or if you're of another faith tradition, whether it be Muslim, Mormonism, whatever the case might be, Buddhism, when not only did your family turn against you, but those in your faith community turned against you. But not just them, but the leaders turned against you. Add to that many of your friends turned against you, and those in acquaintance with you. So at the end of the day, when you looked around, the only thing you had left was a few of your family members, and others of the family members had sided with your son to conspire to kill you and to take your throne, despite the fact that you had done nothing to them. How would that make you feel? I mean, I guess the question is, how do you think David felt? Everything that he had, everyone that he loved had betrayed him. And at that point, he actually chose not to defend himself because he was so down. Now, there were some men that were still with David, warriors and others. David made a big decision. The decision he made was simply this. If God has appointed me to be the king, then God will keep me as the king. And if God has not call me to be king any longer, and it's time for me to step down, then who am I to stand in the way of what it is that God wants? Therefore, rather than take matters into my own hand and go and fight against the Son whom I love, and take his life and the life of my friends and the life of those others, I'm not going to fight this battle. I'm going to leave Jerusalem. I'm going to leave the city of Zion. I'm going to leave all that's here, and I'm going to leave it up to God for him to decide, and only him to decide what's going to be proper. In this way, he didn't pick up any sword. He didn't seek to destroy Absalom. He didn't make Absalom his enemy, although those things would later be rectified, not necessarily by him, but by God in some cases, divine providence. At the end of the day, though, David chose to leave the city. And scripture tells us that as he and his men were leaving the city, they wept greatly. So David, this strong warrior, this man anointed by God, a man that was full of praise and worship for God, found himself leaving the very throne that God had given him to leave the city of Jerusalem. And as he wept with a broken heart because he'd been betrayed by those people that he loved. That's a pretty perilous story. I don't think we think about the emotion that he felt. But have you ever had somebody special and close and dear that you love betray you? Friends betray you? Family members betray you? How did it make you feel? Well, what about if there was 3 of them? And maybe we've had that. 5 of them. 10 of them. But what if there was hundreds that turned their back on you after the only thing that you've ever done was loved and cared for them? You never brought any malice. You never did anything wrong. It was in complete innocence that you stand, and yet there's those that want your position, your title, your power, your wealth, your reputation to be destroyed. That's where David was. But David didn't want to fight. He didn't want to kill his son. He just simply wanted what it is that God wanted. It's probably, arguably, the worst time in David's life. It was probably the lowest point in his life at that point to realize that his very own son, whom he loved Absalom. He loved Absalom dearly. But in the midst of that, it was probably the most emotionally draining and the most emotionally distraught time that is shown by the fact that that was one of the 2 times that it mentions that David wept greatly. The first time was in Ziklag, when his family was taken by the Amalekites. And it says that he and his men wept so much that there wasn't even strength left in them. Second account of that is when his family has now turned against him. And in turning against him, he wept for a different reason, but very similar. Think about that. Think about in the midst of that, of how David could respond. He could have taken 2 roads. He could have taken the row of despair, which simply said, God's not here with me. God's not real. God doesn't have my back. I hate you, God. I'm going to take matters into my own hand, and I'm going to do everything I can out of this despair to kill Absalom and those other men so that I can remain in this place of power. Or despair. He could have shrunken back into some kind of a state where he became a victim. He would have felt himself to be victimized or this victim of circumstance, and so he could have played on the pity of the people. But in the midst of that, what he chose to do was to take a different path and to take his anchor and place it in the hope of God. He wasn't going to fight. If you put me on this throne, and that's what I believe, and if Absalom and the men are coming after me to kill me, I'm not putting my hope in what you did in the past by giving me the throne, or in the future of what Absalom he can do. I'm going to take my anchor of hope and I'm going to place it only in you. I'm not placing it in my mighty men. I'm not going to fight Absalom. I'm not going to fight anybody. I'm going to place my anchor in your presence because this is all I know. I know you appointed me for a season to be a king, but I know that you appointed me any longer than that. Today I'm king. Tomorrow you might have a different king. But I know this. You have a future and a plan for me that only has my good in mind because you love me. And because of that, as much as I'm brokenhearted, as much as this hurts me, the one thing that I'm not going to do is lose or not place my trust in you. You see, that's the choice that we have. Each and every one of us is going to go through journeys and situations. The question is, on our journey of where we're walking, we have two different attitudes we can have towards the same event. We can have an attitude of despair, but we're still going to walk through it. Or we can have an attitude of hope. Whatever it is that you choose, the Christian virtue every single time is the virtue of hope, not the vice of despair. That's why hope in the Christian context is very unique, because it's anchored in the very person of God. That's what hope is. That's what our hope is ultimately in. And that hope is unchangeable. He's made a promise to us, and he has our good, our best, our complete happiness in mind. So out of that context, David leaving the city in a place of weeping, before the tides had turned in his favor, he writes this beautiful psalm. And this psalm is just a work of beauty. And it speaks to the fact that his trust is only and alone in God. This psalm is called the only psalm. The only psalm. Now, it's not that it's the only psalm in the Bible, because there's 150 in ours and 151 in the Eastern Orthodox and in the Catholic Bible. The reason it's called the only psalm is because he's only placing his hope, he's only placing his trust in God. Only God, nothing else. No other circumstance, only God. So this is what he says in Psalm 62. And I'm going to read it in its fullness. And then I'll just make a couple closing points concerning it. And we'll go from there. Psalm 62 reads as follows. My soul waits in silence for God only. For him is my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will you sell a man that you may murder him, all of you? Like the leaning wall and like a tottering fence, they have counseled only to thrust him down, which is him, and his high position. They delight in falsehood. They bless with their mouth, but inwardly they curse. My soul wait in silence for God only, for my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I shall not be shaken. O God, my salvation and my glory rest. The rock of my strength, my refuge is in God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Men of low degree are only vanity, and men of rank are a lie. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than breath. Do not trust in oppression. Do not vainly hope in robbery. Its riches increase. No, if riches increase, do not set your heart upon them. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God, and loving kindness is yours, O Lord, and you recompense a man according to his works. In that psalm, writing about the situation of the betrayal of his son and others, David writes a profound work, profound peace. He says basically, God, only you are my rock. Only you are my salvation. Only you are my fortress. Only you are my hope. It's all in you. I'm going through the darkest time in my life, God. The wicked have risen up against me without cause. They sought to kill me. They sought to dethrone me. They've spoken evil of me when I didn't deserve to be speaking. Sometimes they flatter me to my face, and behind my back they speak of treacherous things. But at the end of the day, I know this, that the low-born men are but a breath, and the high-born are but a sigh. But when placed on the scales before my God, they amount to just a breath in the sigh. But you love the sinner as much as the saint, the despised of men as much as the honored. Therefore, I will trust you at all times, because my hope is in you. 3 things there in closing. Number 1, David found his anchor in the midst of the storm, not in fighting his son and the armies thereof, not in trying to escape in despair, but in taking his anchor and placing it in the rock, which was that of God. In the midst of the storm that he was going through, he chose hope. He chose to trust God than he did that of men. The other thing that David did was he didn't choose the road of despair. He chose the road of hope. I guess how does that translate into our lives is the big question. How does it translate? First of all, every one of us are going to go through difficult times. It can be betrayal. It can be divorce, the death of a loved one. It can be financial loss. Maybe the ousting of you from a job that other people want and think that they can step on your neck to get to it. It can be health concerns. It can be a number of things. And in the midst of that, you're going to go through it. There's nothing that you can do to change it. In many cases, you know it's outside of your control. So the question is, where's your anchor? Is your anchor in God? If your anchor's in God, despair has no place in your life. Only hope. As you walk in the road of God, and going back to the book of Hebrews, what he's telling the people in the book of Hebrews at the height of their persecution is anchor your hope in God, even though they're taking away your houses, even though they're permitting you from fellowshipping. Because you're a Christian, even though they're putting you in prison and potentially putting you to death. Don't let those circumstances become circumstances of despair for you, but let you find yourself with the virtue of hope, which is anchored in the fact that God has you in mind. And he knows exactly where he's taking you. And through the midst of that storm, he knew it was going to come. But if you're anchored in him, you will not be shipwrecked by despair. The question is as you walk this road that you're going to walk called life, you have 2 choices. You can walk in despair or you can walk in hope. The Christian always walks in hope and never walks in despair. Despair is something he keeps from his mind. That doesn't mean we know that there's situations that we're not going to succeed in, but that's an issue of courage more than despair. You see, hope is the strength of mind to know that your your life is wrapped up in the plan of God and your anchor is there no matter what the circumstances are. You have to make the choice. And hope isn't just rot when things are going well. It's exercise when things aren't going well. So welcome the storms in your life. When they come, you're going through them anyway. You can despair, you can whine, you can become a victim, or you can anchor yourself in the love of God and the hope that's in him. And that hope is immovable, unchangeable, and he's promised you at the end of it all, the outcome is going to be good. Well, God bless you. Have a great day. Next week, we'll probably talk a little bit more about hope. Maybe not. Maybe we'll move on to love. Whatever the case is, just want you to have a great rest of your weekend and a great week. See you again next week.